am an innocent man, convicted of a crime I did not commit. From God's dust I came, and to dust I will return. I gotta go. Road dog. I love you, Gabby.
What you just heard were the last words of Cameron Todd Willingham, a man from Texas who received the capital punishment for the mysterious fire that took the lives of his 3 daughters. That's our number 1 story for today, but to make you understand how a system could go this horribly wrong, we start with number 10. At number 10 is the story of George Stinney Jr. He was 14 years old. He was black, and in Alcolo, South Carolina, 1944, the color of your skin could get you electrocuted. It was in March 1944, in Alcolo, South Carolina. 2 young white girls, Betty June Benica and Mary Emma Thomas, went out riding their bikes, but never came back home. Their bodies were found the next morning in a ditch, beaten to death. The town was devastated. Fear and anger grew quickly, and the police moved so fast to find someone responsible. Then, they landed on George Stinney Jr., a black 14-year-old boy who lived nearby and had reportedly been seen earlier talking to the girls. In the racially charged American South of 1944, that was more than enough. George Stinney was immediately arrested and taken away from his family. No lawyer was present. No parent was in the room. Along with the white police officers, the frightened teenager allegedly confessed. George Stinney's trial lasted less than 3 hours, and the all-white jury deliberated for just 10 minutes to decide the fate of a 14-year-old child. There was no physical evidence connecting George to the crime. The alleged confession was never written down and never signed. It only existed in the words of the officers who claimed he had given it. His court-appointed lawyer presented no defense, called no witness, and filed no appeal. And on the 16th of June 1944, just 83 days after his arrest, George Stinney Jr. was executed in an electric chair. And because he was so small, the electrodes could not fit into his body properly. The mask kept slipping away from his face as he was clutching his Bible during his execution. 70 years later, in 2014, a judge in South Carolina vacated George Stinney's conviction. The court found that he had received a fundamentally unfair trial, inadequate legal representation, a coerced confession from a child, and a community so poisoned by racial tension that justice was never possible. 10 minutes. That jury took just 10 minutes to send the child to his death. And I need you to really understand what those 10 minutes were. They were not deliberation. They were not justice. They were simply a mere formality. Because in Alcolo, South Carolina, 1944, the verdict was already decided the moment a black child was accused by a white town, and by people who knew exactly what they were doing. 70 years for the truth, and George Stinney Jr. never got to hear it. At number 9 today is the story of Timothy Evans, executed by the British government for crimes he did not commit. Timothy Evans was a hard-working 25-year-old lorry driver who was living in London with his wife, Beryl, and their baby daughter, Geraldine. In 1949, both his wife and daughter were found strangled to death inside their home at 10 Rillington Place in London. Timothy was immediately arrested, and under intense pressure and scrutiny, he confessed to the crime, a confession which he almost and immediately regretted and took back. He said he was barely literate, confused, and that the police had twisted his words. He pointed fingers at his downstairs neighbor named John Christie, a quiet, seemingly respectable man, but nobody believed him. The jury took just less than 40 minutes to convict him, and on the 9th of March 1950, Timothy Evans was hanged at Pentonville Prison. Then, 3 years later, the new tenants occupying 10 Rillington Place made a horrifying discovery. Hidden inside the walls and under the floorboards were bodies of 6 women, all strangled, killed by John Christie, the very man Timothy Evans had mentioned in the beginning. John Christie confessed to everything, including the death of Beryl Evans. Then it became so obvious that the British government had just killed an innocent man. While this story opened the public eyes to the systemic injustice in Britain, in faraway Australia, an even more disturbing legal system failure was unfolding. That's our story number 8. At number 8 today is a story that traveled all the way from Australia. It was in December 1921 in Melbourne, Australia. A 12-year-old girl named Alma was found raped and strangled to death in a lonely way after failing to return home from an errand. The entire city was in total uproar. Public fear spread across Melbourne overnight. Newspapers demanded answers, and the police moved quickly to find a suspect. They landed on Colin Campbell-Rose, a wine bar owner who only casually knew Alma because she sometimes passed through his establishment. The case against him was entirely built from the testimony of a fellow prisoner who said Rose has confessed to them while in custody. Jailhouse informants, men with everything to gain and absolutely nothing to lose by pointing fingers. Colin Campbell-Rose stood in court and denied everything. He said that all the confessions were fabricated, but nobody, not even one person, believed him. The jury convicted him, and on April 24, 1922, Colin Campbell-Rose was hanged at Melbourne Gaol. He was 29 years old, and he died insisting that the state of Australia was about to kill an innocent man. Decades passed, and in 2006, 84 years after his execution, criminologists and forensic scientists gained access to the original evidence, including hairs that had been preserved from Alma's body. A DNA testing was conducted, and the result was conclusive. The hair did not belong to Colin Campbell-Rose. The biological evidence that was supposed to connect him to the crime connected him to nothing. And in 2008, the governor of Victoria granted Colin Campbell-Rose a full posthumous pardon, making him the first Australian to receive one. At number 7 is a story from China, where a teenager was executed for rape and murder, and 10 years later, the actual killer walked into a police station and just confessed. It was in August 1994 in Hebei province, China. A young woman was raped and strangled to death in a cornfield. Police arrested Nie Shubin, a 20-year-old local man with no criminal history. And after intense interrogation, Nie Shubin confessed. And his family begged anyone who would listen to believe that the confession was beaten out of him. That he was a gentle, quiet young man who had absolutely nothing to do with what happened at the cornfield. Chinese courts moved fast. Nie Shubin was tried, convicted and sentenced to death. And on April 27, 1995, less than a year after the murder, he was executed by a single gunshot into the head. He was 20 years old. And his mother never stopped fighting. She filed appeals, knocked on doors, wrote letters, and demanded that someone should reopen her son's case. Then, in 2005, a full decade after the death of Nie Shubin, a serial killer named Wang Shujin was arrested for multiple rape and murder cases across Hebei province. During his confessions, Wang Shujin casually admitted to killing a young lady in a cornfield back in 1994. He described the crime in precise details, detail only the real killer could know. What followed was one of the longest legal battles in modern Chinese history. Local authorities resisted reopening the case for years because they did not want to admit the mistake. It took until 2016, that's 21 years after the execution of Nie Shubin, for the Chinese Supreme Court to overturn his conviction and declare him innocent. At number 6 today is a story from Britain, where a teenager was hanged for a murder which he did not physically commit, but based on 5 strange words whose meaning is still being discussed to this day. It was in November 1952 in Croydon, London. 2 teenage boys, 19-year-old Derek Bentley and 16-year-old Christopher Craig, broke into a warehouse in the middle of the night. A neighbor who was still awake immediately spotted them and called the police. Then, the police officers arrived and surrounded the building, and at the rooftop, a confrontation unfolded. Christopher Craig was carrying a gun, but Derek Bentley had already been apprehended by a police officer and is being physically held when Christopher Craig pulled the trigger. At some point during the confrontation, Derek Bentley allegedly said, "Let him have it, Chris." Moments later, Christopher Craig shot and killed the police constable, Sidney Miles. Christopher Craig was just 16 years old and could not be sentenced to death under the British law. But Derek Bentley was 19 and he could. The entire case against Derek Bentley was centered on those 5 words, "Let him have it, Chris." The prosecutors argued that it was an instruction to shoot, and the defense argued that it meant hand over the gun. Derek Bentley, although he was 19, had a mental age of an 11-year-old boy. He suffered from epilepsy. He had learning disabilities severe enough that the army had rejected him as unfit for service. He did not fire the gun. He did not touch it. But I guess none of that mattered. The jury convicted him, and the judge sentenced him to death. And on the 28th of February, 1953, Derek Bentley was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. Her only sister, Iris, spent the next 45 years of her life fighting so hard to clear her brother's name. She was writing letters, organizing campaigns, and refusing to let the British government forget what they had done. Then, in 1998, 45 years after the death of Derek Bentley, the Court of Appeal finally quashed his conviction. The judges ruled that the original trial judge had misdirected the jury and that Derek Bentley had not received a fair trial. Christopher Craig, who shot and killed a police constable, did 10 years and went back home. But Derek Bentley, who never touched the gun, paid the price with his life. At number 5 is Larry Griffin, a man executed by the state of Missouri for a crime that the key witness later admitted that he never even saw. It was in June 1980 in St. Louis, Missouri. 19-year-old Quentin Morse was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting at a street corner. Larry Griffin, a black man with a prior criminal record, was arrested and charged with the murder. The entire case rested on one witness, a man named Robert Fitzgerald, a white career criminal who claimed he happened to be at the scene of the shooting. He pointed to Larry Griffin and said, "He is the shooter." There was no physical evidence connecting Larry Griffin to the crime. No modern weapon, no other witnesses, just the words from the same man, Robert Fitzgerald. Larry Griffin maintained his innocence from the day of his arrest till the day of his death. And on June 5, 1995, Larry Griffin was executed by lethal injection. He was 40 years old, and his last statements were pretty simple. He said, "I am innocent. Only God knows the truth." And then came the bombshell. Years after Larry's execution, a man who was actually at the shooting scene came forward and said that Larry Griffin was not the shooter. Robert Fitzgerald, the man whose confession sent Larry Griffin to death row, later admitted that some of his confessions were really unreliable. A thorough investigation conducted by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund concluded that Larry Griffin was most likely innocent. The real shooter was never found, never charged, and never punished. One witness, a career criminal, no other evidence. That was all it took to send Larry Griffin to his early death. At number 4 is a story from Taiwan, where a teenage soldier was beaten to confession rushed through a military trial and executed within months. And then, the government later admitted that they had killed the wrong person. It was in September 1996, at a military base in Taipei, Taiwan. A 5-year-old girl was found raped and killed at a public bathroom near the military base. The crime was horrific, and the pressure on the military authority to find the perpetrator was very high. They landed on Chan Kun-ching, a 21-year-old military conscript with no criminal history. There was absolutely no motive and no connection to the victim beyond being stationed at the same military base. What followed was not an investigation, it was a performance. Chan Kun-ching was arrested and taken into military custody and subjected to what his family and lawyers would later describe as sustained torture, sleep deprivation, physical abuse, relentless psychological pressure, and after days of doing this to him, the young man confessed. The military court moved with immense speed. Chan Kun-ching was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in a process that his defense lawyers said gave them almost no time to mount a proper defense. There was no solid physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The confession obtained under torture was the foundation of everything. On August 13, 1997, less than 1 year after the murder, Chan Kun-ching was executed by firing squad. Many years passed, then investigators reopening cold cases came across Chan Kun-ching's file and found something very strange. A fresh investigation was launched. Forensic evidence was re-examined, and in 2011, 14 years after the death of Chan Kun-ching, the Taiwan Supreme Court overturned his conviction and declared him innocent. The government then formally apologized, and the family received some compensations, and the military officials who had overseen the torture and rushed judgment were investigated. Taiwan did something extremely rare here. They admitted and they apologized, and on paper that sounds like accountability. But Chan Kun-ching's mother waited for 14 years to hear that her son was innocent. And number 3 is the story of Jesse Taferro, one of the most disturbing executions in American history. It was in February 1976 at a highway rest stop in Florida. 2 police officers, Trooper Philip Black and Canadian Constable Donald Iwen, were both shot and killed during a routine check on a parked car. 3 people were in that car: Jesse Taferro, his partner Sonia Jacobs, and a man named Walter Rhodes. 3 of them were immediately arrested. Walter Rhodes was a convicted felon on probation who had every reason in the world to make a deal, and that was exactly what he did. Walter Rhodes cut a deal with the prosecutors, testified against Jesse and Sonia, and then walked away with a life sentence. Jesse Taferro and Sonia Jacobs were both sentenced to death. The entire case against them rested almost entirely on the testimony of Walter Rhodes, a man who had saved his own life by pointing fingers at someone else. Jesse Taferro spent 14 years on death row, maintaining his innocence, and on the 4th of May 1990, Florida strapped him into an electric chair, and what happened next shocked even the correctional officers. The electric chair malfunctioned, and 6 inches flames shot from Jesse Taferro's head. 3 times the switch was thrown, and 3 times the chair caught fire. It took 7 agonizing minutes for Jesse Taferro to finally die. Prison officials blamed a synthetic sponge used in the headpiece. Jesse Taferro was 43 years old. Then, the truth started unraveling. In 1992, just 2 years after the death of Jesse Taferro, Walter Rhodes recanted his testimony and admitted that he had lied. He confessed that he was the shooter, not Jesse Taferro, and not Sonia Jacobs. Sonia Jacobs, who had been on death row, had her conviction overturned and was immediately released. She had spent 17 years in prison for a crime that the actual perpetrator eventually admitted to committing himself. But Jesse Taferro had no such luck because he was already dead. At number 2 is a story from Florida, where a man spent 18 years on death row begging the world to listen, but the world never listened until it was too late. It was in May 1981 in Jacksonville, Florida. A police officer named Thomas Safransky was shot and killed while responding to a distress call. The investigation was very swift, and the police arrested Leo Jones, a black man with no prior history of violence, and brought him in for questioning. But what happened inside the interrogation room became the center of everything. Leo Jones signed a confession. He immediately said that it was beaten out of him, that the police officers had physically abused him until he signed his name on a document that he didn't write and didn't believe in. There was no weapon, no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence, and no lawyer in the room. Leo Jones was convicted and sentenced to death, and from his cell on death row, Leo Jones did something remarkable. He kept fighting, and for 18 years, Leo Jones wrote over 100 letters to lawyers, journalists, and civil rights organizations, and to anyone who might listen. Multiple witnesses came forward and said that they had seen the police beating Leo Jones during interrogation. A forensic expert reviewed the case and concluded that the evidence did not support the state's version of events, and then came the details that should have stopped everything. The jury foreman from Leo's original trial publicly came forward and said he regretted the verdict. The very man who led the jury that got him convicted was now saying that they got it all wrong. Numerous appeals were filed and denied. The court looked at the beating allegations, the expert's testimony, the jury foreman's statement, and still decided that it was not enough. And on the 24th of March 1998, Florida executed Leo Jones by lethal injection. He was 49 years old, and his last statements were, "I am innocent and they know it. God will judge them for what they have done." And here we are at number 1, the story of Todd Willingham, the man whose last statements you heard at the beginning of the video. It was December 23, 1991, in Corsicana, Texas. 2 days before Christmas, Cameron Todd Willingham woke up to his house on fire. And inside that burning house were his 3 children, 2 years old Amber and 1-year-old twins, Cameron and Cameron. Willingham escaped the fire, but his 3 children did not. They all died. What should have been a moment of grief for a father who lost everything became something else entirely when fire experts arrived at the scene. They looked at the burn patterns on the floor, the scorch marks near the front door, and they concluded, using the fire investigations techniques as at that time, that the fire was deliberately set. Cameron Todd Willingham, they said, has killed his own children. Todd Willingham was arrested and charged with capital murder. At the trial, the prosecutors painted him a monster. They pointed to his taste in heavy metal music and his tattoos as evidence of dark character. Willingham's defense was underfunded and overwhelmed. He was convicted on all 3 counts and sentenced to death. And from death row, he did what every innocent man in this series has done. He screamed into the void, wrote letters, and begged for someone to look closer into the fire evidence. He refused a plea deal that would have saved his life, because accepting it meant admitting that he killed his children, and he will never ever do that. In the years following his conviction, fire science witnessed dramatic change. The original investigators were wrong. What they identified as arson signatures were consistent with accidental fires. There was no evidence of arson, and there was no evidence that Cameron Todd Willingham set the fire. One of the world's foremost fire investigators, a man named Gerald Hurst, reviewed the case just weeks before Willingham's scheduled execution, concluding that the arson findings was based on outdated and discredited science. The report landed on the desk of Governor Rick Perry, and on February 17, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was strapped to a gunny in Huntsville, Texas, and injected with a lethal substance. He was 36 years old. He looked at his ex-wife in the witness room and said his last words. The words you heard at the very beginning of this video, words of innocence about God and the people that he loves. And then he was gone. 2 years later, the Texas Forensic Science Commission launched an investigation into the fire evidence. Their independent experts confirmed what Gerald Hurst said to the governor before the execution. The arson conclusion was scientifically unsound. The fire that killed Willingham's daughters was most likely accidental. Governor Perry, now facing a damning report, disbanded the commission and replaced all the members before they could deliver their final findings. The investigation was buried. Cameron Todd Willingham has never been officially exonerated.